everyone. Today's session we are discussing behaviour within and between groups. The lecture will be in two parts. The first part discusses what is a group and defining groups, and then it goes on to discuss intra-group behaviour, so that's behaviour within groups such as group hierarchy. And then the second part of the lecture discusses inter-group behaviour. So that is discussing the psychology of behaviour between groups, why one group might feel different about another group, and those interactions that we might expect, and the research that informs those expectations. So in this part of the session, we will learn to define the concept of groups, to describe the structure and understand the importance of group roles and norms, and then to understand and evaluate intra-group dynamics, so behaviour within the groups, and the group impact on performance. So this includes social facilitation and social loafing. So let's start by discussing what is a group. A group is more than simply a collection of individuals. Collections of unrelated individuals, such as people standing at a bus stop or in a queue in a coffee shop, would be technically considered to be a group of people if you were discussing them in passing. Oh, that group of people are waiting for a coffee or waiting for coffee, or that group of people are waiting for the bus. But in a psychological concept, a group is when those individuals are related in some way. So collections of unrelated individuals is known as an aggregate. Social aggregates are not groups in a psychological sense. They don't have different types of group behaviour between different groups because they don't have a group identity. And they don't have intragroup dynamics such as a group hierarchy and leadership. They're simply a collection of individuals in the same sort of area. So for example, people waiting for a bus, as I said, or people in a shop, this is, a few people, technically more than one person, so you might say it's a group of people, but in a psychological concept it is not actually a group. It can be difficult to determine whether a collection of people can be classified as a group or as an aggregate. However, we're going to discuss over the next few slides what defines groups in the psychological sense. So the first thing that defines a group in a psychological concept is that they must be interacting to some extent. So members of a social group are usually interdependent on each other. They're subject to influence from each other, and they're capable of exerting influence on each other. So let's say that we're discussing a group like a rock band or a pop band. If one member of that band starts wearing their hair differently or starts wearing different styles of clothes, the other members of that pop band might decide to do the same. They might think that it's fashionable, they might think that it helps with group cohesion. Whereas if you went to a bus stop every day and you kind of saw the same people every day or a few times a week, if one of them got a haircut, you wouldn't necessarily feel that was something that you would do as well. So you don't influence each other in aggregates. That's for actual group behaviour. The collection of individuals must also be linked together by some kind of commonality and be distinct from other individuals. So a group of people waiting at a bus stop, they're not linked together by a commonality that is pertinent to their psychology. They're just all getting a bus. Social groups will have features that are similar to all members and features that are different to members from other groups. So let's take religion, for example. In religions, your religion is the same, your beliefs are the same, or at least quite similar to everyone else in your religion or everyone else in that sort of faction of your religion. Obviously, religions have a lot of variability. There's loads of different types of Christianity, for example, but generally you'll have the same beliefs as the people in that same church as you're within that same faction of the church. However, your beliefs will differ. Say if you're Christian, your beliefs will differ from those beliefs of Muslim or Hindus or Jewish people, and likewise they will have a commonality between them and distinctiveness from you and each other. So social groups need to be kind of categorized in that way. Features may be general group traits or specific group practices. So an ethnic group is another type of group, and a group trait might be skin colour or culture. Whereas specific group practices, that might be more associated with religion. So a group practice might be praying several times a day or attending church once or twice a week. The third is that collections of individuals must appear as one unique entity. So social groups will often display a degree of entativity. This is the property of the group that makes it appear to be coherent, distinct, and a unitary entity. So something that makes it different from others, something that makes it a coherent group, and something that you can acknowledge that makes people within that group similar to each other and interacting with each other. High entativity groups will have clear boundaries and are well structured. So let's say a dance group, or a professional dance troupe. They will have clear boundaries. They will have expectations of how to behave. For example, turn up to rehearsal on time, don't miss rehearsals without an excuse, be polite and courteous to each other, and they're well structured, so they're sort of quite organised. You will get low entativity groups, of course, but generally social groups will display some degree of entativity. So the example of the dance troupe would be a particularly high level of entativity. A group is a collection of two or more people who perceive a common definition, are interdependent, and aim to satisfy a common goal or need, and who are structured by group norms and expectations. So that's quite a nice, succinct definition of a group from Johnson & Johnson there. Groups also perceive themselves to be part of a coherent unit, and there are two broad categories of group, and these are common bond or common identity. So, a common bond group involves face-to-face interaction and mutual bonds. So, for example, the women who create the Receipts podcast, so a really successful podcast on Spotify, they have a goal to create content that their listeners enjoy listening to entertain, to educate sometimes, and they have a reciprocal professional and personal relationship with each other. So they have this working relationship, but they're also friends. So we can say that the group, that is the women who do the Receipts podcast, have a common bond group. So it's a common bond identity because they have face-to-face interactions, and they have this common goal and a reciprocal relationship. The other type of group is a common identity, and this is where people are linked via their category, but they're not necessarily bonded to each other. So, for example, students are a type of group that you may identify as, but you don't have to know every single student to be a student. So, for example, a group could be students in general, students in the UK in general, or it could be students in Birmingham, or it could even be students at BCU. So these are all examples of common identity groups because these are social groups that you identify with, but you don't necessarily have the same common goal as other members of that group. You're certainly not working towards that goal together. You don't have relationships with people in that group, but you are part of that group in that is part of your social identity. There's a large variety of different types of groups. So groups can have large numbers of members or small numbers of members. So a national group, for example, British people, French people, that would be a large group, whereas a small group might be a group of friends or a study group where there's only 3 or 4 of you. They can exist for many years or end after a short period of time. For example, an ethnic group will be around from the beginning of time until, well, the end of time, I suppose. That's quite a strange way of putting it, but whereas a jury might only be around for a few hours because they have that group that they're a part of. They have the group has a meaning, but their goal is finite, so it's going to run out. Therefore, that exists for a very short period of time. Groups can be concentrated or dispersed, such as psychology students at UCS, so a university in Shropshire, or students across the UK. So that is still an identity of being a student, but it can be concentrated in one area or dispersed over the UK or even across the world. These groups can be structured or informal, so a police force is a structured group. It has very clear boundaries within the police force, both informal, so unspoken rules, and formal rules that are written down. There are expectations of behaviour, versus a fan club, so there might be a lot of variability in sort of the social norms and etiquette in a fan club, so that would be quite informal. They can be specifically focused or more general, so a protest group has a specific focus. So the recent Black Lives Matter movement, you could say that the protesters in Birmingham are a group with a focused goal of getting this movement to the attention and understanding of politicians and the rest of the country, versus a teenage gang, which is a group of friends who doesn't necessarily have a specific focus other than to hang out with each other and just pass the time. They can also be autocratic or democratic. So an army will be a very autocratic group. So you don't necessarily have much of a say in what happens. In the army, it's very much you get told what to do and you do it, and you do not question, and you do it when you're told. Whereas a commune, where loads of people might live together, loads of adults and loads of children, raising families together, raising each other's children, having this sort of very much loving and helpful relationships with each other, that's more likely to be democratic, where each member of the group listens to each other and people's feelings are really heard. So now that we've discussed the large variability between types of groups and even within groups, now we're going to discuss intra-group behaviour. So just to really clarify, intra-group behaviour is behaviour within a group, so interactions between members of the same group, whereas inter-group behaviour would be behaviour between groups. So let's say an example of intra-group behaviour would be members of the same choir talking with each other and deciding what songs to perform at the next concert, whereas inter-group behaviour would be performing at that concert with other groups, and the interactions between those other choirs, and why those interactions occur in that way. So the next series of slides refer to intra-group behaviour, so behaviour within groups. So we'll discuss group impact on performance. Do we always behave in the same way, or do you think that we behave differently in groups? The individualist perspective on groups is that people in groups behave the same as they do alone or in pairs. So there is no influence on your behaviour by other people if you are in a group. So you will act the same way regardless. And the group processes are simply interpersonal processes between a number of people. So the individualist perspective doesn't really believe in the concept of intra-group behaviour. The collectivist perspective on groups is that people in groups behave differently due to unique group processes, and that's what we're going to be exploring over the next few slides. Cognitive representations are different for members of a group because of the influence of group processes. The group processes that we're going to discuss are social facilitation and social loafing. So these are the two types of ways that we're going to discuss being a member of a group has an impact on your behaviour. So what impact does being a member of a group have on your performance? The earliest social psychology studies actually looked into this, and Triplett in 1898 found that cyclists, so child cyclists, cycle faster when racing against others, and this led to research into the impact of being in a group on performance. So when he observed children cycling on their own, they cycled sort of at a leisurely pace, whereas if they were with other children, they sort of felt the need to race them, so they went faster. This was even if they were trying their hardest in both circumstances, but just the mere presence of someone else, that influenced how hard they worked. There's also animal research into group impact on performance. Evidence has found that many animals behave differently as a result of the presence of other members of the same species, but of course this doesn't happen with members of different species. So for example, cockroaches run faster in groups than if they are on their own. Chickens eat more when they are in groups compared to when they're on their own, and rats copulate more when they are around other groups, other members of their species. So if a rat is simply with one other rat of the opposite sex, they may or may not copulate, but with other members of the same species around them, more members of the same species around them, they're more likely to copulate more. So that explains my picture of the pretty rat in the corner there. So this was termed social facilitation by Allport in 1920. Social facilitation refers to improvement in performance of well-learned, easy or routine tasks, but the deterioration of performance of poorly learned, difficult or unusual tasks in the presence of other members of the same species. So basically, if you're pretty good at something and someone else is watching, then you might do it even better. This might enhance your performance. Whereas if you're not that great at it, and someone's watching you, you'll make more mistakes when they're watching you than if you were performing on your own. Top athletes are lifted by the presence of an audience, whereas mediocre athletes deteriorate under the pressure of being observed. So this has been found in research of conducted on athletes. So there are a few different terminologies that you should know. The first is mere presence. So this refers to the physical presence of a passive and unresponsive member of the same species. So for example, if you are on the treadmill in a gym and someone is walking past you, then they're not paying attention to you, they are simply physically present and they are unresponsive to what you're doing. So they are merely present. The second is co-actors. So this refers to other people doing the same thing, but not interacting with the actor, so with the person. So for example, if you are running on a treadmill and someone else in the gym is also running on a treadmill. Now, audience refers to other people who are watching the action. So the audience effect is the impact of the audience on the performance of an individual. So if someone was literally standing in front of you on the treadmill, well, not on the treadmill, in front of the treadmill, watching you on the treadmill, they would be an audience, and this might impact on how fast you run or how fast you are willing to run. Now, some psychologists have tried to explain social facilitation, and one of those psychologists is Zajunk, who came up with drive theory. Now, drive theory explains that social facilitation is due to your level of physiological arousal. So not sexual arousal, just physiological arousal, how awake your body is, how sort of pumped up your body is. So people are generally unpredictable, and so it's important for us to remain alert and physiologically aroused when we are in the presence of other people. This would be a evolutionary response, so being around other people increases our alertness because you never know if someone's going to harm you. And this increased arousal drives, so this is where the word drive for drive theory comes in, this increased arousal drives towards a dominant response. So if you're very good at something, then the dominant response would be to be very good, to continue to be very good, and that additional arousal would help. Whereas if you're not that good at something, your dominant response would be to kind of fail a little, and this arousal might put you off and be distracting. And so this drives you, therefore, towards an increased likelihood of failure. So an example is Strictly Come Dancing. Strictly Come Dancing combines professional dancers with amateur celebrity dancers. The dominant behaviour for the professionals is to complete the dance without fault, and therefore the presence of the audience will lead to an improved performance. But the dominant behaviour for the amateurs is to make mistakes. Therefore, the presence of the audience will lead to an impaired performance. So we can see drive theory being acted out in the Strictly Come Dancing. Now, there is quite a lot of research supports for drive theory. This being that good pool players, so those who make 71% of shots when they're alone, increase to 80% of shots when under observation, so when they were being observed, when there was an audience. Whereas average players, so those who made approximately 36% of shots when alone, their average decreased to 25% under observation. So there we can see drive theory really act out in that study. The next explanation is the evaluation apprehension model by Cottrell. So Cottrell believed that social facilitation is due to thoughts about what others think of you. So people aim to seek social rewards in the form of approval from other people and avoid social punishments in the form of disapproval. And so people have learned that evaluations are used to determine whether someone approves of you or disapproves of you. Therefore, the presence of others lead to increased arousal due to evaluation apprehension. So this internal fear that you're being judged negatively, or this internal drive to be judged positively. So this sort of increases your levels of arousal, and this impacts on your ability. So increased arousal results in social facilitation. Now this again could be in the form of driving towards the dominance behaviour, if that is positive, so if that results in a better outcome, or it could drive towards increased arousal could make you more likely to fail as well. So an example of this would be if you're practicing a speech in the student lounge spaces at BCU. There are lots of people present, but none are actively evaluating you. So theoretically, your performance would be unaffected. You're not really bothered by them. But if you're giving a speech in front of an interview panel, these people are watching and evaluating you. So therefore you experience arousal, and your performance is affected, be that in a positive or a negative way. Support for this evaluation apprehension model came from research that found that social facilitation occurs only when an audience is actively watching the action. So it has no effect when the audience is present, blindfolded and simply waiting their turn. So basically that social facilitation happens when you are actively being evaluated. So this provides some support for the evaluation apprehension model. But there is some critique for the model as well. For example, this study found that social facilitation occurs even in the presence of an incidental audience who faces the other direction but is engrossed in a different task. So therefore, again, they're not actually evaluating the person. So basically here we've got two studies that pretty much contradict each other. So the jury's still out on the evaluation apprehension model. The next explanation of social facilitation is the distraction conflict theory by Barron et al. So they believe that social facilitation is due to attentional limitations. So people experience both distraction and conflict in the presence of others. Distraction occurs because other people are a source of distraction. Obviously, this doesn't happen when you're alone, you don't have that distraction there. And conflict occurs between attending to the task and attending to others. So you have this distraction and this attentional conflict, and this creates kind of a sense of unease internally. Distraction, so the distraction of other people, will impair tasks, whereas this attentional conflict, trying to ignore people and really focus on your task, will produce arousal, and this will improve tasks. So it really depends on how you harness that distraction, that presence of others, on whether you're going to use that to increase your arousal by ignoring that, but that is still creating an attentional conflict, attentional conflicts, or if you're going to be distracted by them, and then this will actively impair the task. Support for the distraction conflict theory comes from research from Sanders, Barron and Moore that found that social facilitation occurs even when the co-actor is performing a completely different task. So basically you're not trying to compete with them. If they're simply there, then they are sort of contributing to the distraction, and therefore you are likely to experience that attentional conflict, and this will result in social facilitation. But also evidence for social facilitation in response to other distractors, such as noise, movement, flashing lights, can also be explained by this theory. So whilst it explains this sort of social influence on our behaviour, it also explains why other distractions can result in facilitation of behaviour. And this theory also explains why social facilitation occurs in animals, because they can still experience that attentional conflict. So now that we've covered social facilitation, we're going to move on to social loafing. So the Ringelmann effect, so social loafing, can explain why individuals in a rope pulling task exert less force as a function of group size. So if you're in a larger group, less efforts will be put in to pulling a rope than those individuals if they had to do that individually. So if an individual is in a group and pulling a rope, that they will put in less effort in that tug of war than if they had to do it by themselves. This is not simply due to coordination loss. I suppose a tug of war might be trickier trying to balance other people if you're in a group than if you were solo, but rather it's directly related to a loss of motivation. So other people being present results in a loss of motivation to complete a task with all of the effort that you can. Latane, Williams and Harkins coined the term social loafing to explain this Ringelmann effect. And this refers to a reduction in individual effort when working on a collective task compared with either working alone or coactively, so with one other person. For example, students working on a task alone put in more effort than students working on the same task collectively. So if you take two groups of 50 students, so 50 students in one group and 50 students in another, and you ask them to come up with ideas for something, the group that's meant to be working as a group will theoretically come up with fewer ideas than the group of 50 people who are asked to not confer with each other and write down their ideas individually. So that would be an example of social loafing. Now, evidence for social loafing comes from research by Latane, Williams and Harkins again, which found that people, when asked to work together to produce high levels of noise, actually produce less noise when they're in groups. So the individual effort was reduced by 29% in 2-person groups, 49% in 4-person groups, and 60% in 6-person groups. So therefore, the larger the group, the less effort people feel obliged to put in. Now, we're only going to discuss one explanation of social loafing, and this is the output equity by Geen in 1991. So they suggested that people may socially loaf because they expect others to loaf and they do not wish to offer more than the others in the group. Therefore, they are maintaining their output equity. They want to make sure that things are fair, and so they reduce their individual efforts. So how do we reduce social loafing? Why do people socially loaf, and how can we make sure that we are not putting in more effort than others? So social loafing is less likely to occur when people believe their own performance can be identified, so there is some accountability. The group is small, so only working in groups of 2 or 3 rather than, say, 15 or 20. The task is important, so a task in class where I ask you to come up with ideas for something, you might be tempted to not put in that much effort, but you might put in effort if it's 50% of the total module grade. If people perceive their contributions to be important, so they think they're really adding value to a group project, then people are less likely to loaf. If the group is cohesive, so people feel as though they really identify with their group and that their group is interactionary and has sensitivity. And if the group expects to be punished for poor performance, so people really do kind of pull their finger out if they think there's going to be consequences for their actions. So here's just a little sort of infographic to explain social facilitation versus social loafing. So it starts with obviously the presence of others. The social facilitation will occur if individual efforts are evaluated, so you have accountability for your actions. You experience evaluation apprehension, so you do actually care what other people think of your ability and your behaviour, and this will result in social facilitation. Whereas social loafing is more likely to occur if individual efforts are not evaluated, so there's not that accountability for your output. Perhaps you don't care, there's no evaluation apprehension, so like I said, is it a class discussion that you can easily get away with not saying anything, or is it a task that you're getting graded on, in which case then you might be a bit apprehensive about your grades if you don't put in much effort. So this would result, so not having that evaluation apprehension and not having those efforts evaluated is more likely to lead to social loafing behaviours. Now we're about halfway through the lecture today, so now will be a good time for you to pause, go over anything that you've not quite understood, or perhaps have a listen again to something that you, just to clarify that in your heads. Perhaps post on a forum if anything is unclear. The next part of the lecture is going to discuss intergroup behaviour. So it's best to have a 10-minute break now to just refresh yourself before moving on to the next lot of content. Hello again. So in this part of the class, we will very briefly discuss the issues that present with group decision making. We'll discuss how group membership may result in a loss of personal identity and the implications that this has for your own behaviour. We'll understand the major theories of prejudice when we start to talk about intergroup behaviour, and then we'll think about the ways that we might tackle discriminatory thoughts and behaviours as a result of these prejudices between groups. So let's start with group decision making. Decision making in groups can result in a phenomenon called groupthink. So this is a deterioration of mental efficiency, reality testing and moral judgment that results from in-group pressures. So basically, if you're making a decision as a group, sometimes this can actually result in poor decisions because of the social pressures that you might experience of being part of that group. You might not want to speak up if you think something is a bad idea. Or you might be convinced that something is a good idea because other people have agreed to it, even if your expertise is telling you that actually that's not going to work. And this might result in the project ultimately failing because you were too concerned to speak up about things that you might think is a bad idea, or not say when something might go wrong, because perhaps you think that someone else has had a better idea, or maybe you think that you're wrong because everyone else agrees with something. So basically, making decisions in groups can have some quite disastrous consequences. And these consequences occur when individual group members try to minimize these conflicts and reach consensus without critically testing and evaluating their ideas. So, like I said, not saying when something might go wrong. An example of one of these consequences is the Challenger space shuttle disaster in 1986. Now, this occurred when overconfident NASA workers launched a space shuttle against the recommendations that equipment was faulty, and this led to the deaths of 7 people. So, some people they made this decision as a group to go against these recommendations, but possibly if the recommendations had been given to those people individually and they had to make that decision by themselves, then that decision wouldn't have been made and that disaster could have been avoided. Decisions made in groups can also become more extreme than when they're made individually. So when individuals discuss their ideas in groups, the perspective of the group is often polarised. So group members shift their perspective to a more extreme one after group discussion than they expressed originally. So let's say that you are writing for a television show, and you aren't quite sure whether or not a character that you're writing should go on a date with this person, with another character. You kind of think that it would make sense if they went on a date, but because they might sort of go well together, and so you take that decision to a group. Now, other members of that group might also feel that those characters will be well suited, but ultimately the decision of that group might end up being, yes, of course, they're perfect for each other. We all agree that they're suited, therefore this probably means that this is the right decision, and all these people bolster each other's ideas up, and suddenly those 2 characters end up getting married, because the decision has gone from something very small to that big dramatic decision. Another example is the picture at the side of the screen. So you might think smoking's bad, and I mean, even if you smoke, then you probably still think smoking's bad. But you might think smoking's bad and you don't smoke, and then you get in a discussion with a group of people who are vehemently against smoking, and as a result, your opinion changes, and you all agree that smoking should be banned. So as you can see, these smaller opinions, these sort of less impactful beliefs, can become really impactful if a group makes the decision. So let's move on to discussing de-individuation. People refrain from their desired primal behaviour when they believe they can be easily identified, such as when they're on their own. However, in crowds we're not so easily identified and can revert to antisocial behaviour. The mediating factor for this is de-individuation. Carl Jung coined the term individuation, where an individual identifies themselves as being one different being to another. So de-individuation is the opposite. Zimbardo more fully developed this understanding of de-individuation, believing that in a large group you wear a metaphorical cloak of anonymity and responsibility is diffused. You're no longer an individual with consequences for their actions, you're a member of a group and you feel quite powerful. You subsequently lose your sense of personal identity and you lose your fear of negative social evaluation. This group that you're a member of, you feel very connected to, and because they're acting in the same way, you feel that this is a good thing, and so you're having this positive social evaluation. Other people who don't evaluate you positively aren't a member of your group, and so you don't particularly care what they think. This is a state of de-individuation, and behaviour becomes disinhibited. Festinger outlined the environmental conditions that contribute to the process of de-individuation. The first environmental condition is anonymity. So, as we've said, when you are on your own, you feel like you can be easily identified, and so you're more conscious of how others view you. However, when you're a member of a group, you feel more anonymous. You don't feel like you can be so easily identified. Also, when you're a member of a group, then your physiological arousal is heightened. As we mentioned before, the presence of other people means that we are more alert. This alertness leads us on to the third condition, which is a focus on external events. So the more focused we are on external events, the less focused we are on our internal cognitive processes. And so we might kind of forget, or temporarily forget, how we would ordinarily behave, because we're not focused on ourselves, we're focused on external events. And then we have a close group unity. So the closer the unity of a group, the more likely you are to feel de-individuated, because the more closely you align with the group, the less likely you are to feel as an individual and a member of this group. So groups with high entitativity and with high connectivity between the members are more likely to result in de-individuation. These four conditions add to or result in a reduced self-awareness, and this reduced self-awareness ultimately leads to de-individuation. Now, de-individuation can result in several different things. The first being weakened restraints against impulsive behaviour. If you feel de-individuated, then you are more likely to act on impulse. When you can be identified as an individual, you don't want to engage in your impulsive behaviours because you're very aware that these behaviours can be considered to be very negative. However, as a member of a group, you don't feel like you have those consequences because you're not an individual, you're a group member. You have an increased sensitivity to immediate cues or current emotional states. Now, this is because you have this heightened arousal because you're around other people. You have an inability to monitor or regulate your own behaviour because you are turning your attention outwards rather than inwards, and therefore you're more susceptible to this influence from the group. You're less concerned about the evaluations of others, again, because you feel like you're a member of this united group, and so the evaluations of people from outside of that group aren't relevant, and the evaluations of people inside that group are going to be positive because you're behaving in the same way. And you have a lowered ability to engage in rational planning. So you have you're more focused on what's happening in the here and now and don't plan your behaviour ahead. Now, there's a significant amount of research evidence for de-individuation. The first being Festinger, Pepitone and Newcomb in 1952, who found that participants wearing grey lab coats in a dimly lit room were more likely to make negative comments about their parents than did those under control conditions, so those who weren't wearing lab coats and who were in well-lit rooms. Now, this is because under those conditions, you're less likely to be identified as an individual because everyone's kind of looking the same. You can't really make out people's faces because it's dark, and you're all wearing the same coats. So you kind of feel less like an individual and more like a member of a group. Singer, Brush and Lublin found that participants dressed in lab coats were more likely to use obscene language when discussing erotic literature than those who did not. Now, again, this is a similar kind of study to Festinger, Pepitone and Newcomb, because these people are being de-individuated by all dressing the same, and so they are again feeling like a member of a group who is happy to discuss erotic literature because they have made that a group norm for their group where they are all dressed the same and acting the same. Zimbardo also added to the research evidence for de-individuation. He found that students who wore white hoods reminiscent of the KKK gave electric shocks to a learner that were twice the duration of those given by participants not wearing the hoods. And so again, that sense of de-individuation and being a member of a group, especially a group that's associated with violence, is perhaps more likely to make you feel de-individuated. But also, Zimbardo is famous for his infamous Stanford prison experiment. Now, just to really cut a long story short here, students were put into two groups of either being of having to act like prison guards or act like prisoners in a simulated prison experiment where once they entered the prison, they had those roles, so they were acting those roles, but they weren't allowed to step out of character. And this study was supposed to go on for 2 weeks. They found that the guards, when they were all in uniform, they acted very aggressively and they sort of went on a bit of a power trip. And this ended in the study being really quite violent and having to be ended early because it was having such a profound negative effect on the participants who were acting like prisoners. The participants who were acting like prisoners ended up having really bad negative emotional reactions and even some psychosomatic physiological reactions. And this can be considered to have occurred because the prison guards were individuated by wearing a uniform. And as you can see here in a clip, well, not a clip, a picture from the film, they also wore these large aviator glasses to cover up their face, further de-individuating them from their personal selves. The remainder of this lecture covers intergroup behaviour. So this is behaviour between groups. Up until now, we've discussed intra-group behaviour, so that's behaviour within groups. Being a member of a group changes how we treat others within our group and outside of our group. Whenever people belong to a group, whenever individuals belonging to one group interact collectively or individually with another group or its members in terms of group identifications, we have an instance of intergroup behaviour. So, for example, if you are talking to a member of another university and you are and you are actively aware of your different group identifications as a BCU student versus perhaps a University of Birmingham student. This would be an instance of an intergroup behaviour. But why is this, and what's the outcome of these behaviours? So the reason we do this is because of social categorisation. We create cognitive shortcuts in order to reduce our cognitive load. And one of these shortcuts is social categorisation. So our cognitive load is how much effort it is to think about something or to choose a behaviour or to have a thought. And so we create these shortcuts such as social categorisation to reduce the efforts that we put into social interactions. We allow ourselves to make assumptions about others because we've categorised them into groups. Now, often this is useful. For example, categorising someone as categorising someone as a football fan, whereas you yourself are a baseball fan. That might mean that it is easier for you to decide who to invite to your baseball game. Because you know that members of your group of baseball fans are more likely to accept that invitation and enjoy that social interaction, but you wouldn't necessarily ask your football fan friend because they don't really have an interest in baseball. So therefore this cognitive shortcut would be useful rather than asking every single one of your friends if they want to come to this event with you, or just asking those who are interested in baseball. However, faulty and inflexible cognitive shortcuts may result in stereotyping. So this is an oversimplified and generalised impression of a group and its members. And stereotypes can result in prejudice, and prejudice results in discrimination. So we have to be very careful about our assumptions and cognitive shortcuts. So prejudice is a biased negative attitude toward another group and its members. And discrimination is unfair or unequal treatment or unequal behaviour towards others due to their group membership. So prejudice is about attitudes and discrimination is about behaviour. Now, there are some theories of why people have these negative thoughts about other social groups. The first is realistic group conflict theory. So the world is rife with conflicts between groups, such as civil wars, the troubles in Northern Ireland, Palestine and Israel, and Rwanda and Bosnia. However, all of these interactions and these troubles could be described as being as a result of material interests of the group involved. So these include economic interests and political interests as well. Prejudice is a response to intergroup threats. So, according to realistic conflict theory, if you feel that the presence of another group is threatening the possibility of your group achieving its material interest, then they feel this sense of intergroup threat. To it's the group's identity, so feeling that the other group is becoming a more powerful group than them, or to its social position. So this realistic group conflict theory was explored by Campbell. And he felt that intergroup attitudes and behaviour tend to reflect the group interests. So what is literally in the best interests of the group, even if that results in acting negatively towards another group. So it's not actually based on being fair or kind or tolerant. It's literally based on making sure that your group is the most advantaged socially or otherwise. So in lab studies, they found more in-group bias and less intergroup liking and stronger in-group discrimination when groups are in competition. So you are more likely, so this sort of supports the realistic group conflict theory, because if you're in competition with someone for a material item or for some sort of material gain, then there is this kind of intergroup threat, the sense of intergroup threat of them taking what you feel is yours. So lab studies have supported this concept of intergroup conflicts. And outside of the lab, we can see these attitudes played out in our day-to-day lives. For example, American attitudes towards Japanese people became much more negative after Pearl Harbor. And this might have been because they considered them to be more of a threat after this event. Realistic group conflict theory assumes that the most successful way of reducing prejudice and discrimination is to introduce some kind of superordinate, so a goal that both teams, both groups can achieve, introducing some kind of superordinate goal so that opposing groups must coordinate to be successful. And this is found in Sheriff's Boys Camp studies at the Robbers Cave study. What happened in this study was that two groups of children who had never met were sent to this sleepaway camp. They were sent to opposite sides of the lake and didn't have any interaction with each other, had nothing to do with each other. Now, for the first few days, the boys interacted with members of their own group and everything went swimmingly. However, once experimenters introduced the groups to each other, the groups became in competition, and this created this sense of intergroup prejudice and intergroup threats. Experimenters introduced competition for prizes, and this resulted in huge animosity between the groups. There was physical fighting, stealing, burning down things that belonged to each other. And so individual goals had to become group goals. So what happened was the experimenters introduced superordinate goals that the groups had to work together in order to achieve, so they had to work collaboratively. And introducing these superordinate goals reduced conflict because it stopped them from being them and us and turned into we need to achieve something together. So this supports the realistic group conflict theory, because we've seen from, outside the lab, inside the lab, that being a member of a group in a competition with each other increases intergroup dislike. But if you have two groups who have to work together to achieve something, and therefore they are not a threat because you have to work together to get something for both of you, and that material is not finite, then those threats are kind of dissolved, and this reduces the conflict. Another major theory of prejudice is integrated threat theory. Now, anxiety, fear, and threat are at the heart of intergroup conflict. As mentioned with the realistic group conflict theory, the thought that someone else might take something that's yours, or another group might take something that belongs to your group or that your group is working towards, that creates fear and threat and dislike. So this threat results in negative attitudes. If you feel that someone is threatening the ability of your group to thrive, then you're going to feel that negative attitude against that other group. Because you feel this personal threat because you're having something taken away from you, and a group threat because something's being taken away from your group. But of course, if your group fails at something, you might also have this negative sense towards your group that another group might be better than yours. And so you have this sort of like threat of your group identity as well, which you want to protect at all costs. So there are 4 basic types of intergroup threat, according to the integrated threat theory. The first is realistic threats. So a competition for limited resources results in negative relations between groups. So let's take, for example, immigration in the USA. The limited resource might be the perception that immigrants are taking their jobs. So this negative attitude is because residents in the US or US citizens born into the US feel that people who are emigrating to the US legally, illegally, whatever, are taking their jobs. And so they have this negative attitude because this is a finite, limited resource. And so if immigrants are taking these jobs, then they feel that they're becoming a threat to them personally, but also a threat to their group as a US-born American citizen. The next type of threat is a symbolic threat. So this is a threat to the in-group's values, beliefs, or worldview. So, for example, people who are Islamophobic, this might explain Islamophobia, because say that you are Christian and you have this negative perception of people of other religions. This is because they're different. Religious differences, perhaps language differences, their differences in values and beliefs and lifestyles threatens the value of your group. The idea of a symbolic threat is that you think that the presence of other views, the presence of other behaviours invalidates your own experience, which, you know, like thinking about it, there's no way that happens. People can have different beliefs, and it affects no one. But this is one of the 4 types of intergroup threat. The fact that there is another group that feels differently to you, and therefore they're saying that your group is wrong. So this threatens your identity, according to this theory. Then we have the third, which is intergroup anxiety. A threat that arises before or during an intergroup interaction, so when the groups actually do come face to face, due to the expectation of negative outcomes. So, for example, differences in language or norms for social interaction and concerns about being disliked or ill-treated might be more likely to happen between groups, and so that creates an anxiety. And the way that people process that anxiety is to feel that perhaps they're under threat because they're experiencing this negative affect, and they identify this as a threat and therefore feel that the members of the other group are against them, and this creates this feeling of prejudice. And finally, 4, being negative stereotypes. So stereotyping other groups, creating these cognitive shortcuts and putting people in these categories leads people to expect out-group members to behave in ways that will be harmful to the in-group. You believe that your group is better than the other group, you have all these negative stereotypes about the other group, and therefore you feel like they're going to be harmful. So this might be based on the immigrant's country of origin or social class or perceived lack of moral values. You might make these, or hopefully not, but people make these negative assumptions about people from other countries, other places, other social groups, and they feel that they're going to be negative in some way and harm your current social group. And so it's important to identify where something might be true or where something might just be a stereotype. Another major theory that discusses group prejudice is social identity theory. So social identity theory discusses our social identities rather than our individual identities. And Tajfel and Terda define social identities as being those aspects of an individual's self-image that derive from the categories to which he or she perceives themselves to belonging. So, for example, my social identities might be that I am a psychologist, that I am staff at BCU. It might be that I am British and Venezuelan, so I identify with both of those social categories. So these are the social categories that add to my sense of self, and I perceive a sense of belonging from associating with these groups. Now, we invoke part of our social identities when we think of ourselves as being one gender, or ethnicity, or class, or nationality, etc., rather than another. So I have a social identity as a woman, and that differentiates me from people who have social identities as being men or non-binary. My ethnicity is white, and so this puts me in the social group of white people as opposed to other ethnicities, for example. And so we think of ourselves as these social identities. We prefer to see our in-groups in a more positive light than those to which we do not belong, and this is called positive distinctiveness. So as a woman, I might want to see women as being better than men. Or as a lecturer at BCU, I might want to see myself as being better than lecturers at University of Birmingham. So we want to see ourselves as being different, so distinctive, but better, so positive. So this is where positive distinctiveness comes into it. But this positive distinctiveness, so thinking that we are better than other groups, creates an in-group bias, and this is ultimately discrimination because we feel that our in-group is better and therefore out-groups are worse, and therefore we have prejudice against them. This is highly, and discrimination is highly correlated with social identity. The more intense your social identity, the more likely you are to have negative feelings about people with other identities. So considering this, it should make sense that if you are a member of one social group and there is a member of another social group that's very, very similar to you, that you would pretty much just get on. But that's actually not what's been found with social identity theory. If an out-group becomes too similar to an in-group, then it threatens that in-group's positive distinctiveness. So this leads to actually a greater in-group bias and dislike for the out-group, because you've really got to find as many reasons as possible to make yourself distinct from that out-group, make yourself positively distinct from that out-group. And ways to do that are to improve your own view of your own group and decrease the quality of your opinion of the other group. So actually, groups that are similar are more likely to incite this feeling of intense hatred. So social prejudices can actually be far worse if groups are similar. Freud referred to this as the narcissism of small differences. So having small differences between your group and another group is actually more likely to incite issues of hatred. And we can see this in civil wars and in genocides across the globe, how groups who live very, very close to each other and who interact a lot and who have very similar religions actually have a lot of social issues and social unrest and conflict because their groups are very, very similar. So this explains again the tendency for some religious or cultural groups to devote enormous amounts of energy to their mutual degradation. Any differences seem desperately important, and we must highlight those differences so that we can feel better about our own groups. So, now that we have discussed those different groups, what happens when there actually is a ranking or there is a perceived ranking? So you think that your group is better or worse than another group, or should be treated, you think your group is better than another group, but you think that your group should be treated better than the other group. you think that your group should have a higher status. Well, what happens when groups do have higher statuses? Now, for example, let's say smokers and non-smokers. In the grand scheme of society, smokers are looked down on as being a lesser group than non-smokers. Not in general, you wouldn't judge someone massively and absolutely hate them, but you would, feel that your group is better than their group if you're a non-smoker because you're not engaging in this unhealthy habit. So what happens in groups like that where we can see that there is some kind of social hierarchy? So the high status group will express or restate their socially defined superiority. An equal status group will attempt to achieve or create some positive distinctiveness between them and another equal status group. But what happens when people are in low status groups? Well, actually we found that people who are in low status groups actually show less in-group bias. So high status groups show a lot of in-group bias. They really feel like they are so much better than everyone else. And we see that as well for equal status groups. They just want to create distinctiveness and try and make themselves seem better. But they don't display these massive, this massive in-group bias that we see in high status groups. And in low status groups, we see even less in-group bias. So, if the boundaries are considered permeable, then people in these lower status groups will try and join people in the higher status groups. Let's take, for example, the identity of smokers. If you see your non-smoking friends as being as having this higher social status, you can permeate the boundary between the groups by switching groups, by quitting smoking. By quitting smoking, smokers are able to cross the boundary from the lower status group into the higher status group. But what happens when a group isn't of high status, but those boundaries aren't permeable? Now, let's consider races. As we all know, white people are very much more privileged than other social groups, and therefore in the technical conversation of social psychology, they would be considered a higher status group. And this is not opinion, this is simply that white people are massively privileged and therefore they live with all of these privileges, all of these benefits, and so therefore they would technically be a higher status group. Unfortunately, other social groups or other ethnicities don't experience this white privilege, and so they will be considered to be of lower status groups. But this boundary between social groups is not permeable. You can't change your race. And so what happens if you perceive yourself to be part of a low status group, and whilst you really want to have this in-group bias, you are associated with this lower status? Well, actually, research has found that people who are in lower status groups might try and distance themselves from their own groups. For example, if boundaries are considered legitimate and impermeable, then people in lower status groups might try and distance themselves from being members of that group. Now, this research in 1947 demonstrated this quite well, and found that young black girls were showing a preference towards playing with white dolls. They identified this as being the black girls wanting to disassociate from their racial group and associate more with the higher status white group. Now, one thing that I would like to draw your attention to here is that this study is very old. It's in 1947, and although racism is still a massive issue in society and still in the UK, there isn't the outright overt what's the word I'm looking for? Basically sanctioned racism that there was in 1947. And we've also got a much better relationship with pride. So if this research was done now, then it might be that we wouldn't find that same outcome, because rather than nowadays, rather than showing less of an in-group bias, individuals from oppressed minorities might actually show a lot of in-group favoritism because they have this pride in their identity. And so this is actually a really good critique of social identity theory, that sometimes if you're a member of a lower status group, you can feel a lot of pride in being a member of that lower status group. So that, if you're considering this, is quite a good critique of this model, showing that it actually doesn't cover everything, and some people in low status groups don't actually feel that negative view towards their own group. So if these boundaries are considered impermeable, then you should get creative. So for example, if we take the low status group of smokers compared to the high status group of non-smokers, if those smokers do not believe that they have the ability to quit smoking, rather than joining the group because they don't feel like they have that ability, they might get creative and simply decide to create a positive distinctiveness between the groups by rating themselves as more likable than the higher status group. So this helps them to protect their ego, because even though they are in a lower status group, they still feel that they are in a that they are more likable than those in a higher status group. And so this is how we protect ourselves against prejudice from other groups. And finally, if boundaries are considered illegitimate, so if they are considered to be not supported, so you don't agree with the boundary, and impermeable, then you challenge the status quo. Now, one thing that we are seeing at the moment is that with the Black Lives Matter movement in the summer of 2020, we are seeing this challenge of the status quo. So whilst race might be considered a legitimate boundary in that it cannot be changed, nowadays we are seeing that whilst this is a legitimate boundary, it shouldn't actually be something that defines status. It is impermeable because you cannot change groups. However, you can't change ethnicities. However, we can challenge the status quo by protesting, by signing petitions, by bringing it to the attention of politicians that black people should be treated in a much fairer way, and bringing people's attention to this systematic racism. And that's what's happened this summer, and hopefully will carry on happening until this issue of racism is eradicated, hopefully within our lifetimes. So that's what happens if you don't consider the differences between your groups to be legitimate. You don't consider yourself to be able to travel from one group into another, and so you revolt against these changes. You try and become a higher status group or an equal status group. And so as there's been a lot of discussion over summer regarding the Black Lives Matter movement and if these protests should have been going ahead. And according to social identity theory, this is the best way to create social change, to create equality between groups, by challenging this status quo. Now, there are many possible theories of prejudice, and we've covered a couple of the major theories of prejudice, but I'm just going to touch on another couple of more minor theories of prejudice. There are so many theories. So the first is that we have an innate bias against the unfamiliar. So we are naturally inclined to fear and dislike the unfamiliar, as it could represent danger. And so any people who are sufficiently different to our own group will be met with prejudice. Now, this is a good argument against the thought that no one is born racist. Now, actually, according to evolutionary psychology, everyone is born racist, because you are born to favour your in-group, because back in the caveman days, if you didn't favour your in-group and you would just talk to any group and you wandered over to another tribe, then that tribe could kill you. So we actually are born as having this innate in-group bias towards people of our own race, of our own culture. And so to say that no one is born racist is actually a cop-out. It's actually much better to identify that we probably all have racial biases, and that we need to actively address those. It's far more reasonable and rational to say that everyone has these biases and we need to actively work to address those. Saying that no one is born racist and I don't see colour and things like that, that's just a cop-out. That's simply not true. So, the next theory of racism, or theory of prejudice, is the frustration-aggression hypothesis. Now, this is basically scapegoating. So frustration inevitably leads to aggression, and all aggression is preceded by frustration. We experience frustration with an agent, so another group perhaps, that is big or powerful or inappropriate, and so our subsequent aggression is displaced onto a scapegoat. So let's say, for example, we are living in a famine, and we can't do anything about this and we're really frustrated by it, and so what we do is we take it out on other people who are fighting us for our materials, for our food, for our medicine, and so people go, well, immigrants. That's an example of scapegoating. So there's nothing you can do about the situation, and so you decide to blame someone. Now, this explains the frustration-aggression hypothesis. You have this frustration and you take it out on someone when it's not necessary. Another theory is the system justification theory. So some people resist social change and seek to protect the existing social system, even if that places their group at a disadvantage. Now, again, we can discuss immigration here. There's actually so much evidence to suggest that immigrants in the UK add a massive amount to our economy, bring in so much, so many different cultures, so many different experiences, absolutely diversify and make our country so much greater for having these experiences and this knowledge. People with different educations, so actually the presence of immigrants in any country would enrich the country by expanding our horizons, expanding our knowledge and our experiences. However, some people resist this social change and seek to protect the existing system, and that's what, for example, Donald Trump is doing. He doesn't want any immigrants in his country because he wants to keep America great. He doesn't understand how America can be great with the presence of immigrants, and so actually he's trying to keep America great, even though that's actually placing his group of Americans at a disadvantage, because immigrants going into the country bring so much more a wealth of knowledge, diversity, culture that he's missing out on. So, you know, you're missing out there, Trump. These people accept an ideology that justifies and protects their status quo by maintaining prejudiced attitudes towards other groups. So he maintains that he should keep America great and not let immigrants in, because rather than acknowledge that they might have different cultural experiences, different knowledge, different expertise, he says that Mexicans are rapists and thieves and drug dealers. So he justifies this by saying, oh, well, they can't possibly add to us because they're criminals. So this is a good example of a system justification theory in action. Another theory of prejudice is belief congruence. So, we are more likely to surround ourselves with people who share similar beliefs, and therefore we kind of think that we are in the right. You guys, or a lot of you guys, will be too young to remember, too young to have voted in the last general election. But you might be aware that a lot of people who voted Labour were absolutely shocked when there was a landslide victory for Conservatives. Now, this is because if you are Liberal, if you are a Labour voter, you will surround yourself, so you're more likely to surround yourself with other people who vote Labour. And therefore, to you, the majority of people you speak to vote Labour. So why would Conservatives win? But Conservatives will see this as well, because they will have the same experience on the opposite side. So both groups are experiencing belief congruence. They think that their group is in the right. So people that have dissimilar beliefs, you're more likely to have this reciprocal dislike because you have so much in common with people from your own group that the people from the other group must be wrong. We dislike people who conflict with our beliefs, and this may lead to prejudice and discrimination. Now, we've discussed what prejudice is and what prejudice is and the theories of how people develop prejudice beliefs and attitudes. So how do we go about reducing prejudice? Well, Allport came up with the intergroup contact theory. He believed that intergroup prejudice can be reduced if members of different groups are brought together under optimal conditions. So basically, if you meet someone from another group under positive circumstances, then this can reduce your negative attitude toward that group because there's not that sense of fear and dislike. You've met someone that you liked, so they can't be all bad, and this helps to chip away at that prejudiced attitude. So here are Allport's 4 optimal conditions for reducing intergroup hostility. The first is having equal status. So members of the contact situation should not have an unequal hierarchical relationship. So it should be absolutely acknowledged that those members who are meeting each other from different groups are not in any sort of hierarchy. So the group should not be an employer and employee or an instructor-student relationship. They must have a peer relationship at the outset. There must be cooperation. So members should work together in a non-competitive environment. We should have those superordinate goals present rather than working together to compete for something, because that's actually more likely to increase intergroup prejudice. So there should be, again, common goals. This fits in well with cooperation, but there absolutely has to be a common goal to achieve. And this relationship should be supported by social and institutional authorities. So there should not be a social or institutional authority that explicitly or implicitly sanction contact, and there should be authorities that support positive contact. So it shouldn't be allowed that the groups can discriminate against each other. Otherwise, you don't have this societal support. The groups need to have that equal status, and it shouldn't be the case that the authorities don't support a positive step towards that relationship. So, how does contact work? Well, it works by reducing intergroup anxiety, by showing each group that the other group isn't a threat. And it promotes a common group identity. Again, they are not us and them, they become a we. And this allows for the development of empathy. You can be with other people from other groups and see that they have a different lived experience to you, but that doesn't make them a threat. However, if contact isn't if the atmosphere of contact isn't positive, then this can backfire. If you have a positive contact with another group, then this can help your relationship, but negative contact might exacerbate or confirm negative attitudes. So if you have a contact session with a member of another group, but that contact doesn't go well, then this doesn't automatically mean that everything's going to be fine between your groups because you've had contact with each other. The positivity or negativity of that contact actually makes a big difference. Then there's also the quantity versus quality of contact. Actually, frequent contact with members of other groups might give the perception that this group is more of a threat than they actually are. And so sometimes the quantity of contact isn't the more important thing. It's making sure that that contact is positive. There has been research into the efficiency of intergroup contact to reduce prejudice. Pettigrew and Trop analysed 515 papers and found that in 94% of studies, intergroup contact does decrease prejudice. They were quoted as saying, "This study firmly establishes that intergroup contact reduces prejudice." However, the effects are weaker for the minority group. Now, this is really, it's understandable. If you have groups that are that are trying to meet with each other to reduce prejudice, then the group that is the oppressor, seeing that the other group that they have been oppressing is not a threat, perhaps they can just get over it. However, the group that's being oppressed, the group that's experienced this discrimination, this racism, this homophobia, etc., they're far less likely to suddenly go, oh, thank you for no longer seeing me as a threat. I no longer dislike you. Because they've had this like systematic oppression for so long. And so it's the contact with the other group, the effects of promoting relationships are a lot weaker for the minority group. Contact might actually weaken the willingness of minorities to challenge the majority groups as well. So intergroup contact might reduce efforts to reduce prejudice. It might increase liking, but it does not necessarily lead people to oppose discriminatory laws and practices. For example, you might meet some people who don't have any issue with gay people, but don't really agree with gay marriage, like that kind of thing. So they've had come into contact with gay people. They have relationships in work, possibly in their home life with gay people, but actually they don't just oppose discriminatory laws. It's just like a very casual, I'm not going to actively discriminate to your face. So do we actually overcome discrimination through majority group liking or minority group collective action? So let's reflect on this with response to the Black Lives Matter movement. Again, is it better that we have sort of peaceful protests that are liked by the majority, or who are liked by the government, by the racists, because they are quiet and they don't cause much of a fuss? Or is it the collective action, the actively and incessantly fighting against racism? Is that actually what's going to be the most successful way to tackle racism? And actually, history shows that the best way to tackle unfair behaviour and discriminatory behaviour is by actively having a collective action and opposing the status quo. Now, sometimes it's not possible to have actual intergroup contact, and so there are a couple of other alternatives to direct intergroup contact. The first is extended contact. So knowing people who have contact with an outgroup might affect our attitude to that outgroup. So perhaps you have these internal homophobic feelings, and you're sort of working on not being homophobic, but you're baby steps. Actually speaking to a member, someone who you do have contact with, who has contact with the outgroup, with your outgroup, then that might actually ease your sense of prejudice. Or you could try imagined contact. So imagining oneself in contact with outgroup members, and this can affect our attitude to that group. So just imagining what contact with people from other groups might be like. Now, of course, a lot of the things that I've said in the last part of this lecture are on the assumption that everyone has biases. I'm not saying that you're racist. I'm not saying that you're homophobic. I'm not saying that anyone's anything. In fact, it would be absolutely fantastic if no one in my class had these negative, oppressive views. However, I'm simply saying that from the perspective of these theories of prejudice and these theories to reduce prejudice, this is what would work. Now we've come to the end of this lecture, so thank you very much for taking the time to view the lecture, and good luck with your quiz. Bye.